As y'all probably know by now, I kind of love bullying Anthropic. As great as their models can be, they have their weird behaviors and things that I just don't love about how the company operates. One of those things in particular is the way they treat open source. I've never been super fond of it, but they recently acquired Bun, the JavaScript runtime that I do dearly love, both the framework and the runtime itself, as well as the team building it. And it seems like with this acquisition, a new focus on open source is happening, which is why this announcement, as crazy as it is actually quite cool. Anthropic just donated the Model Context Protocol to the new Agentic AI Foundation. If you're curious what this is, spoiler, it's a new fund that was just formed under the Linux Foundation. Yes, really. The Linux Foundation are now the owners of the Model Context Protocol. This is a fascinating new development, both the creation of this new agentic group within Linux Foundation, but also MCP becoming a more open standard that exists in an external entity instead of just being part of Anthropic. This is super, super exciting stuff. Projects like this are only possible because well-funded companies like Anthropic, Block, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon support them. But we need support too, so let's do a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is different, and I want to give you guys a bit of history on them. They started their journey as the best possible API for giving context on your code base to different AI agents. So if you're trying to build your own AI that deeply understands your code base, their product built around like modern grep. It turns out that's useful for a lot of other things though, in particular, code review. If an AI agent knows everything about your code base, it can actually give you really good feedback when you're trying to change it. The sponsor is Greptile, and I want to show you what this looks like in practice. This is a code review on a real repo. It's Physics Nemo by NVIDIA, like actual, real, big, legit project. Greptile left a review here, gave it a low confidence score, 3 out of 5, but God, I love this feature so much. The way that it will tell you how it feels overall, it's just so clear and easy to know, like, do I need to give this another look or not? Confidence score is a 3, but the reason why is where it gets interesting. Greptile called out that there is a precision calculation issue on this particular line. The piece that's interesting here is it can only know this with that code base context, that the way that these values are calculated other places is to put both of these values underneath when it's doing this division. One of the maintainers claimed otherwise, saying that the true positives over predicted positives can be greater than 1, which is correct in their understanding. Greptile responded, which is what makes it so different. Looking at your concern, I need to clarify the issue. The formula on line 200 is indeed wrong, but true positives over predicted positives cannot be greater than 1 when calculated correctly. The problem's on line 196. It's calculating the count of all true class 0 labels, which should be called actual positives, not true positives. For precision, true positives is the same. You get the idea. It's a really good fellow code reviewer, and as we can see here, Kelvin confirmed as much. Turns out I was wrong and overlooked the true positives as the intersection. I fixed this and also flipped the positive as label 1. There you go. If all of your code reviews are still being done by humans, you're wasting all of those humans' time. Pull in Greptile today at soidev.link/Greptile. Donating the Model Context Protocol and establishing the Agentic AI Foundation. Today, we're donating the MCP to the Agentic AI Foundation, AIF, a directed fund under the Linux Foundation, which is co-founded by Anthropic, Block, and OpenAI with support from Google, Microsoft, AWS, Cloudflare, and Bloomberg. One of these things is not like the others. Bloomberg's code discipline in particular is actually really good. Their TypeScript stuff is incredible. I thought MCP was a little more than a year old. Is that really right? November 25th, 24? Wow, yeah, it's 1 year later. That's crazy. Almost to the dot. 1 year ago, Anthropic introduced MCP as a universal open standard for connecting AI applications to external systems. Notably, connecting and external systems, implying that the server that you're connecting to is expected to be live and maintain a connection during the entire session, which makes it really annoying to deploy and adopt. There's a couple cool new companies working on figuring out solutions to that now, but yeah, the way MCP is implemented is really focused on making the agent side as easy as possible, not on making the developer implementation side on the other end as easy as possible, or really viable at all. MCP has achieved incredible adoption. There are over 10,000 active public MCP servers covering everything from developer tools to Fortune 500 deployments. Across platforms, MCP has been adopted by ChatGPT, Cursor, Gemini, Copilot, Visual Studio Code, and other popular AI products. Enterprise-grade infra now exists with deployment support for MCP from providers including AWS, Cloudflare, Google Cloud, and Azure. It does make sense that the big clouds would want to be part of this. It's also nice having them supporting Linux Foundation more. You're not already familiar with Linux Foundation. No, they're not like the people who make Linux. It's a little more complex than that. The Linux Foundation is an attempt to take a lot of like open source work and orchestrate it while also getting money in memberships from big companies to try and make sure the direction of all of these important big open source projects continues to make sense for how everybody is using them. They have a fascinating set of projects, including, of course, the Linux kernel, RISC-V, and PyTorch. So the things underneath them are really important and fascinating. Do you guys remember the chaos around Redis? Remember when they changed the license and suddenly all the other providers that hosted it had to not do that or use an old version? When that happened, both AWS and Microsoft put a lot of money in order to fund the development of a fork called Valkey that included a bunch of the original maintainers of Redis as well as people maintaining it at Azure and at AWS. They then, instead of trying to run this independently and separately, donated it to the Linux Foundation alongside, I'm sure, more donations. The result being the Linux Foundation now owning a good open standard for Redis-style use cases that is truly open and will stay open. I don't think there's any example of something that went to the Linux Foundation to be a well-maintained open source project, then locking down, which is a big reason why Anthropic would be interested in this. There's always fear that an open standard could get closed. And the way you counter that is going really far alongside it, which is what happened here. Since there's now concern about Redis potentially changing its license and the rug pull that can occur, the alternative to that isn't another thing that can be rug pulled. It's to throw it at Linux Foundation so it will be there, hypothetically speaking, forever. A lot of the things Linux Foundation maintains are things that just have existed forever and probably will as well. It's also worth noting that the Linux Foundation has other sub-foundations that they help operate as well, like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, OpenJS Foundation, the Open Source Security Foundation, and more. There's a lot of these foundations that they help manage and run. Is OpenSearch their attempt to do Elasticsearch? Because I know that they had an Elasticsearch alternative at some point as well. Regardless, a new one has just been dropped, which is the Agentic AI Foundation, which is one of the Linux Foundation projects. The AIF provides a neutral open source foundation to ensure the critical capability evolves transparently, collaboratively, and in ways that advance the adoption of leading open source AI projects. It is kind of funny that the Open Linux Foundation Agentic AI Foundation is funded by the companies doing all of the closed weight models. Has Anthropic released any open weight anything in the last 3 to 4 years? I'm pretty sure no. OpenAI just recently did one, but you would expect a Mistral or a DeepSeek to be here, but they also don't have the funding to justify it. It is cool to see, though. They now have MCP as well as Goose, which is an open source extensible AI agent that goes beyond code suggestions. Interesting. And Agents MD they also own. Very interesting, actually. I did not realize that Agents MD was big enough to go to a foundation like this, but that does make sense. And I've seen more and more cool uses of Agents MD files. So this is cool. Oh, interesting. Goose is by Block. If you're not familiar with Block, they are a company that owns a lot of different things. They own Square, Cash App. They bought Tidal, which is close to my heart, as well as a few other things. It was founded by the original founder of Twitter. Cool-ish company. No issues with them. It's cool seeing them doing more open source stuff like this. Wait, no way. Yeah, I know Rizal. She's great. That's so cool. I had no idea she was at Block now. That makes a ton of sense. Good for her. Good stuff. Local AI agent autonomously engineering tasks seamlessly. This is a good set of things. It's cool to see something like this forming now. It's a weird set of projects. You have a markdown file standard. You have an actual big open source AI agent toolkit, and then MCP, which is a protocol for interfacing with agentic stuff. Very interesting set of things, especially when you look at the set of members that they have. The Block membership makes much more sense now. Seems like they kind of want to pawn Goose off there, but also the Block founders have always been very, very pro open source things, so it does make a lot of sense there. Back to the article. Oh, they have a whole fancy little timeline of the history of MCP here. Early adoption from Cursor and other AI tools back in December to February. MCP was presented at the AI Engineering Summit. There was 2,000 public MCP servers at the time. A second spec came out, which included enterprise auth, HTTP streaming, multimodal content, but also the enterprise auth solution they picked was lackluster at best. It's my understanding that they used an existing HTTP standard for auth that had never really been implemented by anyone. That kind of sucks. And as such, it was not something many people did. It's also funny that 1,000 people register for the MCP night in San Francisco because that's happening again tonight, and I will be there. That's why I'm ending stream early. At this point, they had 4,000 public MCP servers. Then June to July, the third spec came out with structured outputs, which is essential to have the MCP actually output things in a consistent shape. interactive prompts, as well as hardened security. They also introduced the MCP directory, and 2,000 people took part in the Agents Hackathon. Then enterprise MCP hosting started happening on Google Cloud, Azure, and Cloudflare. MCP Dev Summit sold out in London. This is also around when we started to see these, like, the pushback on the idea that MCP is a thing that is just how models will do application development and application style work make less and less sense. And that's when I did the videos about the Cloudflare article about turning MCPs back into code and then letting the agents write code to execute instead. Watch those videos if you haven't and you want to better understand the things I don't like about MCP, as well as how we can take advantage of the standard more effectively. This is interesting, though. I also don't think the growth is that impressive. From like the first 2 months, they got 2,000 servers. And then over the next 10 months, they got another 8,000. That's relatively linear growth. I'm once again going to run a poll. Do you use MCP? Yes, a lot. Greater than 5 servers. Yes, a bit. Less than 5 servers. Not really. Nope. I'll change it to tried but churned. I should have put a just context 7 option. I'll do another poll after for that. Yeah. Gave up on context 7, which is the only MCP I was trying to use after the last poll in chat. According to my audience, 56% of people don't use MCP. 16% tried and churned. 25% use it a bit. And 4% use it a lot. It's kind of crazy how close a bit of use and tried and churned are. But this is my experience too. I just have not found many use cases for MCP in my day-to-day usage. Yeah. The use case I see for it, funny enough, is much stronger locally. I've yet to find many MCPs that are useful if you run them remotely. Like there's the Mac MCP that lets you control your Mac. Oh, of course, Supermemory are the ones doing it. The Mac MCP is pretty cool. The point of it is that you can control features on your Mac via MCP. There's a bunch of TypeScript code written to do things on your Mac, exposed over a local server that your AI agents can call and do things like send texts or update your notes, touch your contacts. And here you can see in Darvia's example, he tells it to send a message. This is a test to somebody. And now it's running behind the scenes on his Mac, doing the things that he requested, which is pretty cool. But those are the use cases that I think are the most valid right now due to the strangeness of how the protocol is implemented. There's also like the Ableton MCP. If you're a music nerd, it's pretty cool. Ableton MCP is another very fun one. It's for controlling the Ableton Live digital audio workstation. It's a very common tool for producing music. And Ableton MCP lets you modify your project in Ableton using Model Context Protocol. But once again, since you have to run a full dedicated server for this to work, you have to set up the Smithery CLI, install this MCP, and specify the client is Claude. You probably have to install UV as well because it's all a Python server. And then spin it up and run it locally in the background. Because like MCP can't execute things that it doesn't have. It is effectively an HTTP server that is exposing specific behaviors to a model and allowing for it to stay connected to this server so it can do things and get data and make changes. Another notable thing about these examples is none of them require complex auth stories because auth is one of the most annoying nightmares across all of these things. I don't even know if you can auth an MCP server in Cursor. Oh, fun. You have to hard code the tokens or you can pull them from environment in the definition that you paste in for the project. Fascinating. Yeah, it's cool they do support it now. You also have to manually toggle the features that you do and don't want it to have access to on and off. Fun. You couldn't tell I don't use MCP in Cursor a whole bunch because I don't use MCP a whole bunch. You can also return images as long as they're base 64. Fun. Man, what an interesting standard. Back to the article because there are more important pieces here. We're continuing to invest in MCP's growth. Cloud now has a directory with over 75 connectors, which are powered by MCP, and they recently launched the tool search and programmatic tool calling capabilities in their API. I like that they worded this carefully so they don't have to call it the tool search tool as they have been constantly. They did tool search and programmatic tool calling capabilities, which helps with production scale MCP deployments, handling thousands of tools efficiently and reducing latency in complex agent workflows. Yeah, that's a big step. It feels like Anthropic recognizes that improving the standard is not necessarily within their area of expertise. And instead of trying to patch it again and again, it is much more efficient for them to hand it off to a better open standards committee that can be designed. I know design by committee is terrible, but for things that are standards that are going to be adopted by many, it makes a lot more sense make the standard external so it can be iterated on, developed, and owned safely, openly, and externally, and continue building the new features on top. It definitely seems like their recent interest has less been in changing how MCP works and more in building things around it. Like if we go back to the timeline, they got early adoption, they presented it, they released the second spec, which included the auth stuff. Then in June and July, they did the third spec with structured outputs, interactive prompts, and hardened security. And since then, a lot of the new stuff isn't really part of the spec. Like discovery isn't really part of the spec for MCP. Async tasks are, but are more like an implementation detail on the thing consuming. And agentic sampling, I don't even know what they mean by that. Interesting. Sampling allows for the server to reverse request back to the model to do a thing. So if you're using Opus 4.5 and it uses the MCP for, I don't know, doing a query against your database to get some data, and then your code realizes, because you wrote the code this way, that it has to have the right SQL to generate, it can forward back that request to the model to generate the SQL string that it has to run. I've never seen anyone using this. This is really interesting too. There's a hints section, which is an array of arbitrary JSON objects by the looks of it, but there's separately this intelligence priority and speed priority things that are top level keys, which means that they're probably part of the spec. Man. Yeah, you can see the chaos that is this diagram. The server initializes the sampling with the sampling create message. A human can review that request. They're presented the request for approval. They could request a modify or just approve it, and then it forwards that request to the LLM, returns a generation. You can review the response. The response is presented to the human for approval, and if they approve it, it gets sent back to the client, which then sends it back to the server to continue. Man, when I say it feels like all of this is chaotically over-engineered, do you understand? It is also kind of chaotic that the client in this case is something like if you use the Claude AI desktop app or if you use Cursor, the server is sending a request to the client that the user then approves so the client can then resend it to the LLM. This weird graph of where everything lands is just strange. It can also request images back and audio. This feels like a standard looking for a problem still. Like, who's going to implement this? What tools exist right now where if I wrote my MCP server to then request an image back to the client that will handle that properly? I just don't think there's going to be many. Oh, and then, yeah, these are standard. Cost priority, speed priority, and intelligence priority. Cost priority, higher values prefer cheaper models. Speed, higher prefers faster. And intelligence, higher prefers more capable. And the values, by the way, are between 0 and 1. Great. Then the hints allow servers to suggest specific models or model families. Again, they had Claude 3 Sonnet and then Claude as a fallback. Yeah, interesting. So yeah, that is a new part of the standard. It's not one I've heard anyone talking about, but they did add something. But it does generally feel like the standard in the spec has less been Anthropic's focus and more the things they're building around it, which makes the punting of it off as they build new tools on top of it make more and more sense. It is also, like, to be fair, a really good faith play to say we're not just building MCP for our own use cases and tricking you all to build on top of it. They do clearly want MCP to be a winning open standard. I have no reason to believe that any of their way of doing this is malicious. I still have my skepticism around MCP, but I don't think they're doing this because they're dumb or evil. I think they do genuinely believe this is an important thing to exist and that it is the best chance we have at an open standard for AI to do things on real systems. Still kind of crazy that they're making this so open, and Claude code is still closed source, and they've sent as many DMCAs as they have to GitHub about people who shared the source maps for Claude code when they leaked them in their own package when they deployed it. Just saying. The Linux Foundation and the Agentic AI Foundation. The Linux Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering the growth of sustainable open source ecosystems through neutral stewardship, community building, and shared infrastructure. It has decades of experience stewarding the most critical and globally significant open source projects, including Linux, Kubernetes, Node.js, and PyTorch. Yeah, Node is technically part of it too, which is nuts. Importantly, the Linux Foundation has a proven track record in facilitating open collaboration and maintaining vendor neutrality. Yes, absolutely yes. Node runs just as well everywhere, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, you all know how much people complain about Next.js being easiest on Vercel. Node works everywhere, other than Cloudflare, kind of. But you get the point. Node is a very much supported standard that works equally well pretty much everywhere. It's really cool that that's proven. Same with Linux kernel. I would imagine a significant portion, if not the majority of the money that Microsoft makes on Azure right now is going through Linux systems. The Agentic AI Foundation is a directed fund under the Linux Foundation, co-founded by Anthropic, Block, and OpenAI, with support from all the other companies I mentioned before. The AIF aims to ensure agentic AI evolves transparently, collaboratively, and in the public interest through strategic investment, community building, and shared development of open standards. The idea of agentic AI evolving transparently by making MCP an open standard is an interesting thing. I would imagine that transparent evolution of AI and agentic work would involve more transparency around how the models are being trained, which none of the labs are willing to do. Some deeply skeptical part of me wants to see this as an attempt to look more transparent when they are more than ever closing off their research and work so people can't copy their details. But I do really want to read this in good faith because there's no reason not to, at this point at least. I'll be keeping my eye on it. And now the donating MCP section. Anthropic's donating the Model Context Protocol to the Linux Foundation's new Agentic AI Foundation, where it will join Goose by Block and AgentsMD by OpenAI as founding projects. I didn't know AgentsMD was OpenAI. That does make sense. Bringing these and future projects under the AIF will foster innovation across the Agentic AI ecosystem, as well as ensuring that these foundational technologies remain neutral, open, and community-driven. The MCP's governance model will remain unchanged. The project's maintainers will continue to prioritize community input and transparent decision-making. There is a lot of work on this. I've seen so many issues that are hundreds upon hundreds of replies deep, as well as their shared Discord server. They are trying to make it better. I've had a lot of people, like more so than almost anything I've complained about, I've had a lot of people who are part of the MCP spec and standards committee replying and reaching out, trying to figure things out, especially the auth thing, because it seems like the auth stuff's a total disaster. The future of MCP. Open source software is essential for building a secure and innovative ecosystem for agentic AI. Today's donation to the Linux Foundation demonstrates our commitment to ensuring MCP remains a neutral, open standard. We're excited to continue contributing to MCP and other agentic AI projects through the AIF. Yeah, this is cool. If they want to prove that it's an open standard, they did it right. But it also kind of seems like Anthropic can only have one open source project at a time. And now that they have Bun as their big open source project, MCP has been moved away. OpenAI's article about this foundation has even more interesting stuff. I'm going to read this a little too. Similar blurb here. It is cool that they're calling out that they're working with Anthropic and Linux Foundation, Block, all of them. I've never seen OpenAI call out Anthropic as a supporter and Anthropic call out OpenAI in matching articles the same day. Weird to see this much alignment and genuine collaboration on the standards here. Why open standards matter? Developers are rapidly adopting AI to build more capable agentic systems, from coding assistants to workflow automation and customer service agents. In 2025, these systems have begun to move from prototypes into tools that handle real work in business and consumer settings. We believe the transition from experimental agents to real-world systems will best work at scale if there are open standards that help make them interoperable, like a standard for a markdown file. Open standards make agents safer, easier to build, and more portable across tools and platforms, and they help prevent the ecosystem from fragmenting as the new category matures. As more agents begin handling real responsibility, the cost of fragmentation increases. Without common conventions and neutral governance, agent development risks diverging into incompatible silos that limit portability, safety, and progress. You were around for the early web days between like the 15 different attempts to do dynamic web apps. I see why jumping on this early is a thing they're all focused on. Agents SDK isn't open source, is it? What is the license? MIT? Is it standard MIT? It is. Cool. OpenAI's history with the Agents SDK, Apps SDK, and Agentic Commerce Protocol is cited here as proof that they really want to contribute to these building blocks and open standards. And Codex CLI was a pretty baller move. When they dropped that as an open source project, I was surprised. I did not see that coming, especially after how strictly Claude Code has stayed closed source. It's a baller move on their part. And then they did the GPT OSS models, which, believe it or not, I'm still using GPT 120 Bill quite a bit. It runs really well on my laptop too. Is the Apps SDK open source as well? There's no way. These are just examples. Yeah, that's what I thought. The Apps SDK is not open source. Also, to give Anthropic a little more grace here, the Apps SDK and the idea of apps in ChatGPT was so hyped when they announced it, and I haven't seen anyone use it for anything. Like, not a single thing. Apparently, the UI portion is open source, but Yeah, no one's using it. I don't care. They've been early adopters and core contributors to MCP, incorporating it as a foundation for connectors and apps in ChatGPT. Just last week, they announced a collab with Anthropic and MCP UI to extend the apps SDK to all MCP developers through MCP apps. Oh, great. They're combining the two standards I don't like. And they donated AgentsMD. AgentsMD has been adopted by more than 60,000 open source projects and agent frameworks, including AMP, Codex, Cursor, Devon, Factory, Gemini CLI, GitHub Copilot, Jules, and VS Code, among others. Jules mentioned, that's Google's agentic coding tool that nobody knows about. There's also a bunch of other things they're not calling out here. Like I know that CodeRabbit and Greptile both use AgentsMD very well as well, which is super helpful during code review steps. It's cool that we don't have the problem that we have with a JavaScript project, like the classic config hell. Look at all these dot files, the .envs, .gitignore, nvmrc, oxlint, prettier rc, components JSON, nip JSON, agentmd, all these things. It is pretty cool that the agentmd is now just one file that works with everything, and we're not going to have as bad of config hell. Like there was a bit where you had to have the cursor MD, cursor rules, agentmd, windsurf's equivalent, and like 15 other things. AgentsMD has been standardized enough that like everyone uses it. That said, different tools benefit from different types of instructions, which it varies. Still overall a very good thing, especially if more and more of these tools adjust to follow the AgentsMD standard better. This seems cool. I really like this type of collaboration and alignment. I think it leads towards better things happening. I really like the idea of the Agentic AI Foundation, where if a thing becomes popular enough that is meant to be open, the Linux Foundation can now own it as part of the AAIF. This makes a ton of sense. I wish I had more negative to say because it's fun, but this is a good thing. This is the best future for MCP. This is a really good thing for all of these standards, and it makes the future of agentic AI tooling much, much safer and potentially much better. Curious what y'all think, though. Am I way too excited about this, or is this just another weird MCP thing? Let me know what y'all think, and until next time, peace, nerds.